At my own wedding, my mother-in-law tried to replace me, and for a moment, everyone thought she had succeeded. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just smiled. I'm Emily Carter, and at 67, I thought I had already seen every kind of family drama life could offer. I had raised 2 children, buried 1 husband, and spent years rebuilding a quiet, steady life I could finally call my own. When I met Daniel Collins, he didn't bring chaos into my world. He brought calm. Kind, patient, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Loving him felt easy. Saying yes when he proposed felt even easier. But loving Daniel meant stepping into a family where I was never truly welcome. Margaret Collins made that clear the very first time we met. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. It was in the way her smile never reached her eyes, the way she looked at me as if I were something temporary, something that would pass. "You're older than I expected," she had said over coffee, stirring her cup long after the sugar had dissolved. I had smiled then, too. I had learned a long time ago that not every battle needed to be fought out loud. Still, I believed something different about the wedding day. I believed, foolishly, that even Margaret would respect that. I was wrong. The morning of the wedding was everything I had dreamed of. The sky was clear, a soft blue stretching endlessly above the venue. The garden smelled like fresh roses and cut grass, and the white chairs were lined in perfect rows, waiting for the people who were supposed to witness something beautiful. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress. It wasn't extravagant. I didn't need extravagant. It was simple, elegant, ivory with delicate lace along the sleeves. The kind of dress that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. For a moment, I let myself feel it. The quiet happiness, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this chapter of my life would be different. Then the first crack appeared. It was small, so small that anyone else might have missed it. When I walked into the reception hall to check on the final arrangements, I noticed a second bridal bouquet sitting on the main table. Not similar, not complementary, identical. Same ivory roses, same silk, ribbon, same careful arrangement. I paused, my hand hovering just inches above the petals. "There must be a mistake," I said softly to the coordinator. She hesitated, glancing down at her clipboard. "Mrs. Collins requested it," she replied. "Mrs. Collins. Not me. Margaret." I nodded slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of the table as if grounding myself. It was just a bouquet, I told myself. Just a detail. Weddings are full of details. But something inside me shifted. A quiet awareness. Because Margaret didn't make mistakes. And she never did anything without a reason. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. I simply turned, walked back toward the dressing room, and adjusted the sleeve of my dress as if nothing had happened. I caught my reflection again in the mirror. Calm, composed, smiling. The same way I had smiled the day she first tried to put me in my place. The same way I would smile when she tried to do it again. What Margaret didn't understand, what she had never understood, was that I wasn't the kind of woman you could quietly push aside. I had spent too many years learning how to stand still and see everything. And as I stood there, listening to the distant sound of guests beginning to arrive, I realized something with perfect clarity. This wasn't going to be a perfect wedding, but it was going to be unforgettable. I sat in the dressing room with the door half closed, the quiet hum of voices outside drifting in like distant waves. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed just enough for me to notice the details I would have once ignored. The soft rustle of fabric as I adjusted my dress. The faint scent of roses lingering in the air. The way my hands, though steady, felt colder than they should have. I looked down at them and smoothed my palms against the fabric, a small habit I had carried with me for decades whenever something did not feel quite right. The second bouquet stayed in my mind, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Margaret did not duplicate anything unless she intended to replace something, or someone. I reached for the edge of the vanity and leaned forward slightly, studying my reflection again, not for beauty, but for truth. There were lines on my face that had not been there 20 years ago, and silver woven through my hair that no amount of careful styling could hide. I did not resent them. They were earned. Every year, every loss, every quiet decision to keep going had shaped the woman looking back at me. But I knew what Margaret saw when she looked at me. She did not see strength. She saw an inconvenience, a mistake her son had made. The door opened softly behind me, and Daniel stepped in, his expression warm, his tie slightly crooked the way it always was when he was nervous. He smiled when he saw me, and for a moment, everything else faded. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low and sincere, and I believed him because he had never been a man who said things he did not mean. I returned his smile and reached up to straighten his tie, my fingers brushing against the familiar fabric as if anchoring both of us in this moment. "Are you ready?" he asked. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, searching for any sign that he sensed what was unfolding beneath the surface of his carefully planned day. But there was nothing there except trust. Trust in me. Trust in his family. Trust that everything was as it should be. "I am," I said gently, because in that moment, it was not his burden to carry. He kissed my cheek and stepped back, giving me one last look before leaving the room, and as the door closed behind him, the quiet returned, heavier this time. I waited a few seconds, listening. Then I stood, smoothing my dress one more time before stepping into the hallway. The venue had come alive while I was inside. Guests were arriving, voices blending together in polite conversation, laughter rising and falling in soft waves. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I moved slowly, not wanting to draw attention, letting my eyes take in what had changed in the short time I had been gone. And then I saw her. Margaret stood near the front of the ceremony space, speaking with the coordinator, her posture straight, her expression composed, her presence unmistakable. Beside her, placed carefully on a chair near the aisle, was the second bouquet, positioned exactly where a bride would stand, not where a guest would sit, not where an extra decoration might be stored, but where a bride would stand. I stopped walking, just for a moment. No one noticed. No one ever noticed the quiet moments. That was where the truth lived. I exhaled slowly, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed, as if nothing about this scene was unusual, as if I had expected it all along. Because now I understood. This was not about small humiliations or subtle insults. This was something else entirely. Something planned. Something deliberate. Margaret had not come here to support this wedding. She had come to control it. And if she could not control it, she would reshape it into something that belonged to her. I turned my head slightly, watching her from a distance, noting the way she spoke, the way people listened, the quiet authority she carried as if this entire event had been built around her approval. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, I smiled. Not because I found any of it amusing, but because I had finally seen the full picture. And once you see something clearly, it becomes very difficult to be surprised by it again. I did not walk toward Margaret right away. I let the moment breathe. I let the room continue its gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the soft laughter that floated through the air as guests settled into their seats. Weddings have a rhythm, a kind of quiet choreography that most people never notice. People arrive, they greet each other, they take their places, and they trust that everything unfolding before them is exactly as it should be. That trust is what makes it so easy to reshape a moment without anyone realizing it. I moved along the edge of the space, my steps measured, my posture relaxed, as if I were simply another guest admiring the arrangements. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. Why would they? I was supposed to be the bride. And yet, standing just outside the center of it all, I felt like I was watching something carefully constructed begin to shift into something else. As I passed one of the ushers, I heard him speak quietly into his headset, repeating instructions that sounded slightly off, slightly different from what I remembered discussing the day before. The timing had changed. The order of entrance had been adjusted. Small changes, harmless if taken individually, but together they formed a pattern. I slowed my steps, letting my gaze drift naturally toward the front again. Margaret had moved closer to the aisle now, her attention fixed on the coordinator, her voice low but firm, the kind of tone that suggested authority without ever raising volume. People listened to that tone. People followed it. I had seen it before at family dinners, at holidays, at every gathering where she positioned herself just slightly ahead of everyone else, guiding the conversation, shaping the atmosphere, deciding what was acceptable and what was not. This was no different. Only now, the stage was larger. I continued walking until I reached the side table where the ceremony programs were arranged in perfect stacks. I picked one up, more out of instinct than curiosity, and glanced down at the printed schedule. The names were correct. The order was not. My name appeared, but not where it should have been. not in the place reserved for the woman walking down the aisle. Instead, it had been shifted, subtly, almost cleverly, into a position that suggested something secondary. A participant, perhaps. Not the center. Not the bride. I traced the line of text with my finger, the paper cool beneath my skin, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Recognition. This had not been done in a rush. This had been planned. Adjusted. Refined. Every detail considered until it looked seamless enough that no one would question it. Except me. I set the program back down exactly where I had found it, aligning the edges carefully, restoring the illusion of perfection. Around me, guests continued to arrive, their voices warm, their smiles genuine, completely unaware that the structure of the ceremony itself had been quietly rearranged. I lifted my head and looked toward the aisle once more. The second bouquet remained in place, untouched, waiting. Not as decoration, as a statement. And suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. Margaret was not trying to embarrass me in small ways. She was preparing to erase me in a very public one. To step forward, to redirect the ceremony, to present a version of this wedding that fit her idea of what it should be, with or without my place in it. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders settling, my expression softening into something almost serene. Because now that I understood the shape of her plan, I also understood its weakness. Plans like that rely on silence, on confusion, on the assumption that the person being displaced will hesitate, will question themselves, will wait too long to respond. I had spent too many years learning when not to speak, and more importantly, when to act. I turned away from the aisle and began walking back toward the dressing room, my pace unchanged, my steps steady. To anyone watching, I was simply a bride taking a final moment before her ceremony. But inside, something had already shifted. Not into panic, not into fear, into clarity. And clarity, I had learned, was far more powerful than either. I closed the dressing room door behind me with a soft click and stood still for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me like a shield. Because out there everything was already in motion, every detail shifting into place according to a plan that had not included me. And yet inside this room, I still had something Margaret did not expect. Time, even if it was only a few minutes. Even if it was only enough to decide what mattered and what did not. I walked slowly toward the vanity and rested my hands against its surface, grounding myself in something solid, something real, while my reflection looked back at me with the same calm expression I had worn all morning, the same composed smile that had never once slipped, not when I saw the second bouquet, not when I read the altered program, not even when I realized that this entire ceremony had been carefully rearranged to push me aside without ever making a scene. That was her style. Clean, polished, quietly ruthless. I had seen it before, just never on this scale. I reached for my phone, not in panic, not in urgency, but with the kind of deliberate movement that comes when a decision has already been made, and I scrolled through my messages until I found the one I needed, the conversation from 3 days ago that I had almost dismissed at the time as unnecessary, overly cautious, perhaps even a little paranoid. But I had learned, over the years, that instincts rarely arrive without a reason. The message was from Claire, the assistant coordinator, a young woman, with careful eyes and a habit of lowering her voice when she shared something she was not entirely sure she should. She had asked me, quietly, if all final decisions for the ceremony were still being approved by me directly, or if she should begin confirming changes through Margaret, since Margaret had been very involved in the past week. I had thanked her. I had told her to copy me on everything, and I had kept every message since. I tapped the screen and opened the thread, scanning quickly, not because I did not remember, but because I wanted to see it again now, in this moment, when everything finally made sense. Timestamps, instructions, adjustments that had never been cleared with me, requests phrased as suggestions, then repeated as expectations. And then, the final message from late last night, the one that had felt strange even then. Mrs. Collins asked if we could hold the second bouquet near the aisle for a special moment during the ceremony. She said you were aware. I had not been aware. Not until now. I lowered the phone slightly, letting it rest in my hand, and exhaled slowly, feeling something settle into place inside me, something steady and certain. Margaret had not hidden what she was doing. She had simply counted on no one connecting the pieces. She had counted on silence, on assumption, on the idea that I would walk into this ceremony and follow whatever path had been laid out for me without questioning it. I set the phone down gently on the vanity, aligning it with the edge as if even that small act of order mattered, and then I reached for the small envelope tucked inside my bag, the one I had prepared earlier that morning, not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because I knew enough about Margaret to understand that control was never something she would give up willingly. Inside the envelope were copies of every confirmed plan, every approved detail, every version of the ceremony timeline that had been agreed upon by the venue, the officiant, and myself. Clean, clear, signed. I had not planned to use them. I had hoped I would not need to. But hope, I had learned, is not a strategy. I slid the envelope back into my bag and straightened, smoothing the front of my dress once more, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, the same quiet gesture that had carried me through years of moments where speaking would have cost more than silence. Outside, I could hear the music beginning to shift, the signal that the ceremony was about to start, the final transition from preparation to performance, and I knew that whatever Margaret intended to do, she intended to do it soon. I looked at myself one last time in the mirror, not searching for reassurance, but acknowledging what I already knew. I was not unprepared. I was not unaware. And I was not someone who could be quietly replaced. I turned toward the door, my hand steady on the handle, and this time, when I stepped back into the world she had tried to reshape, I was no longer observing it. I was ready to change it. I stepped back into the ceremony space just as the music shifted into something softer, something expectant, and the subtle change in atmosphere moved through the crowd like a quiet signal that everything was about to begin, that whatever had been uncertain or unfinished was now settling into place. And for most people, that meant anticipation, but for me, it meant confirmation, because I could see it now with complete clarity, the way Margaret had positioned herself just slightly ahead of the moment, standing near the aisle with that same composed expression, her posture straight, her presence commanding without ever appearing forceful, and beside her, exactly where it had been before, the second bouquet waited, not hidden, not explained, simply there, as if it belonged, as if it had always been part of the plan. I did not rush forward. I did not interrupt. I moved at the same measured pace I had used all morning, letting my steps carry me along the edge of the gathering guests, offering small nods, quiet smiles, the kind of polite acknowledgments expected from someone about to take center stage. And yet no one stopped me, no one redirected me, because no one knew there was anything to question. That was the brilliance of it. Margaret had not created a scene. She had created a version of events that looked so natural, so seamless, that no one would think to look closer. I reached the front row just as the officiant took his place, adjusting his notes with a calm familiarity, unaware that the structure of the ceremony in his hands no longer matched the one I had approved. I glanced briefly toward him, then toward the coordinator standing just a few feet away, her eyes flicking between Margaret and the aisle, uncertainty hidden just beneath her professional composure. She knew something was off. She just did not know what to do about it. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that could be mistaken for simple acknowledgement, but her shoulders shifted slightly, as if some unspoken permission had been granted. Then I turned my attention back to the aisle. Guests were settling into their seats now, the low murmur of conversation fading into a respectful quiet, programs folded neatly in laps, all eyes beginning to orient toward the front where the ceremony would unfold. And Margaret, standing there with effortless confidence, looked exactly like someone who believed she had already won. I could see it in the way she held her chin just a fraction higher, in the way she spoke to the coordinator without needing to raise her voice, in the way she had arranged every detail to align with her version of what this day should be. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine how it would have played out if I had not noticed. If I had walked down that aisle following the altered plan, stepping into a ceremony where my role had already been diminished, where the sequence would unfold in a way that gradually shifted attention, gradually repositioned me, until by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would already be too late to question it without causing a disruption. That was her strategy, not confrontation. Replacement. Quiet, controlled, undeniable. I inhaled slowly, feeling the air fill my lungs, steady and even, And then I did something very simple. I stepped forward. Not dramatically, not abruptly, just one step out of line with where I had been standing. One step that placed me exactly where I was always meant to be. It was small, almost invisible, but it changed everything. The coordinator noticed first, her eyes widening just slightly before she quickly masked the reaction. The officiant looked up from his notes, his gaze landing on me with a brief flicker of confusion that resolved itself almost instantly into recognition. And Margaret, who had been mid-sentence, paused. Just for a fraction of a second. Just long enough for me to see it. That tiny break in her composure. That moment where something did not go according to her plan. I met her eyes across the space, my expression calm, my posture relaxed, my presence steady, and I did not say a word. I did not need to. Because in that moment, the balance had shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but unmistakably. And for the first time since this day began, Margaret was no longer the only one controlling what would happen next. Margaret recovered quickly. I will give her that, because women like her do not lose control easily. They adjust, they redirect, they pretend the shift never happened. And within seconds her posture straightened again, her expression smoothing into that same polite confidence she wore so well. But something had already cracked, something small and almost invisible, and I knew she felt it just as clearly as I did. The officiant cleared his throat softly, glancing between us as if recalibrating, and then he smiled, a practiced, reassuring expression that signaled to the guests that everything was proceeding exactly as planned, even though it was not. The music changed again, a gentle cue that it was time, and I saw the coordinator step forward, her movements slightly quicker now, guided not by Margaret's quiet instructions, but by something else, something more certain. Me. I did not rush to take the bouquet. I did not reach for it at all. Instead, I walked past the chair where it rested, leaving it exactly where Margaret had placed it, untouched, unnecessary, a prop waiting for a moment that would never come. That was the first real break in her design. Subtle, but undeniable. I took my place at the center of the aisle, not where the altered program suggested I should stand, but where I had always intended to be, where every original plan had placed me, where every step of this day had been meant to lead. And because I stood there without hesitation, without explanation, everyone else adjusted around me. That is the thing about certainty. It does not need permission. Daniel appeared at the end of the aisle, his expression softening the moment he saw me, and whatever confusion may have existed in the room dissolved in that instant, because to him, there was no question, no alternative version of events, no quiet manipulation that could override what he knew to be true. I was where I belonged. He began walking toward me, each step steady, each movement grounded in trust, and I felt something settle deeper inside me, something stronger than the calm I had been holding on to all morning. Not relief, not victory, something quieter, something earned. As he reached me, his hand found mine, warm and certain, and he smiled in that way he always did, as if the rest of the world did not exist in that moment. "You look even more beautiful now," he whispered, and I almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because it was so completely untouched by everything that had been unfolding beneath the surface. I squeezed his hand gently, grounding both of us, and then I lifted my gaze, not to the officiant, not to the guests, but to Margaret. She was no longer at the front. Not quite. She had stepped back, just a fraction, repositioning herself among the guests as if that had always been her place, as if she had never intended to stand where she had been standing only moments before. But the second bouquet was still there, still waiting, still visible, and now, without its purpose, it looked exactly like what it was. Out of place. The ceremony began, the officiant speaking in a calm, steady voice. Words about commitment and partnership filling the space, and the guests leaned in, their attention fully captured, unaware of how close the entire structure had come to shifting into something else entirely. I listened, but not to the words. I listened to the rhythm, to the way everything had settled back into alignment, to the absence of Margaret's quiet influence guiding the moment. She had not lost loudly. She had not been exposed in any dramatic way, but she had been stopped. And more importantly, she knew it. I did not look at her again. I did not need to. Because the second bouquet remained where it had been placed, untouched, unclaimed, a silent witness to a plan that had unraveled without a single raised voice, without a single confrontation, without anything more than a quiet refusal to step aside. The officiant's voice carried gently through the garden, steady and practiced, the kind of voice that people trusted without thinking, and as he spoke about commitment and partnership, I felt the weight of those words settle differently inside me, not as something fragile or idealized, but as something grounded, something that had already been tested long before this moment ever arrived. I stood beside Daniel, my hand resting in his, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to be fully present in what was happening, not what had almost happened, not what had been quietly attempted just minutes before, but what was real, what was still mine. The guests listened attentively, their faces soft with expectation, their attention fixed on the ceremony unfolding in front of them. And if any of them had noticed the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible correction that had taken place, they did not show it. To them, everything appeared seamless. And in a way it was. That was the beauty of quiet control. It did not disrupt. It restored. When it was time for the vows, Daniel turned toward me fully, his expression open, unguarded, and he began to speak, his words simple, sincere, untouched by performance or expectation. He spoke about patience, about second chances, about finding something steady in a world that had not always been kind. And as he spoke, I realized that nothing Margaret had tried to do could ever reach this part of the moment, this space that existed entirely between the two of us. This was something she could not rearrange. This was something she could not replace. When it was my turn, I took a breath, feeling the quiet stillness of the room settle around me. And I spoke just as simply, just as clearly, not with grand declarations, but with the kind of truth that does not need to be dressed up to be understood. I spoke about choosing, about how love is not something that happens once, but something that is decided again and again, even when it is not easy, even when it would be simpler to step away. And as I spoke, I felt something shift in the space around us, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that settled deeper than anything that had come before. The ceremony continued, rings exchanged, promises made, each step unfolding exactly as it should have from the beginning. And with every passing moment, the version of events Margaret had tried to construct faded further into irrelevance, replaced entirely by what was actually happening in front of everyone. But even as the moment built toward its natural conclusion, I remained aware of her presence, not because I was watching her, but because I understood her. People like Margaret do not simply step back and accept defeat. They observe. They wait. They look for another opening, another way to reassert control without drawing attention. And I knew, with a certainty that came from years of experience, that she was already thinking about what came next. The officiant's voice softened as he reached the final words, the familiar cadence signaling the close of the ceremony, and the air itself seemed to pause, as if holding its breath in anticipation. I tightened my hold on Daniel's hand just slightly, not out of nervousness, but out of awareness, because this was the moment where everything shifted from quiet to visible, from contained to shared, and if Margaret intended to make one last attempt, this was where she would do it. I lifted my chin just slightly, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, and I did not look toward her. I did not need to, because whatever she chose to do next, I was no longer reacting. I was ready. The officiant's final words settled into the air like a quiet conclusion, and for a brief second, everything felt perfectly still, the kind of stillness that only exists at the edge of something important, just before it becomes real. Then he smiled, turning slightly toward us, and spoke the words everyone had been waiting for, the words that would make this moment official, undeniable, complete. The guests leaned forward, their attention sharpening, their expressions soft with anticipation, and I felt Daniel's hand tighten gently around mine, not out of hesitation, but out of presence, as if he, too, understood that this was the moment where everything we had built quietly came into the light. But just as the officiant began to finish the sentence, a voice cut through the air. Calm, controlled, familiar. I believe something has been overlooked. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Margaret's voice carried with a kind of precision that did not disrupt the moment, but redirected it, pulling just enough attention to shift the focus without appearing to create a scene. The officiant paused, just slightly, his expression flickering with uncertainty before he turned toward her. The guests followed his gaze, curiosity moving through them in soft ripples, heads turning, eyes searching for context. And Margaret stepped forward, not fully into the aisle, not enough to appear intrusive, but just enough to be seen, just enough to matter. There was supposed to be a special acknowledgement, she continued, her tone composed, almost helpful, as if she were correcting a minor oversight rather than interrupting a ceremony. A moment that reflects the family's wishes. I did not move. I did not look at her. I let the silence stretch for a fraction longer than most people would have been comfortable with. And in that silence, I felt the room begin to shift, not toward her, but toward the absence of a response. That was the difference. If I had reacted immediately, if I had turned, questioned, engaged, the moment would have belonged to her. But I did not give her that. Instead, I turned my head slowly, not toward Margaret, but toward the coordinator. Just a glance. Just enough. The coordinator hesitated, her eyes flicking between Margaret and me, and then, with a small but decisive movement, she stepped forward. All acknowledgments were confirmed and finalized, she said gently, her voice steady despite the tension beneath it. We are proceeding as planned. Margaret's expression did not change immediately. It rarely did, but I saw it. That subtle tightening at the edge of her mouth. That brief pause where she recalculated, where she realized that the structure she had been relying on was no longer responding to her direction. I see, she replied, her voice still smooth, still controlled, but now carrying something just beneath the surface, something sharper, something that had not been there before. She glanced toward the second bouquet, still resting where she had placed it, still waiting for a moment that had already passed, and for the first time, it looked exactly like what it was. A plan that had not been completed, a statement that had not been understood, a move that had not landed. I shifted my gaze to Daniel then, meeting his eyes with a calm, steady expression, and whatever question may have been forming in his mind dissolved the moment he saw me. He did not ask. He did not hesitate. He simply nodded, a small, certain movement that said everything without needing words. And just like that, the moment moved forward again. The officiant cleared his throat softly, offering a polite smile as if nothing unusual had occurred. And then he continued, his voice steady, his tone warm, carrying the ceremony to its natural conclusion. The guests relaxed, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had formed, and the focus returned to where it belonged. Not on Margaret, not on the interruption, but on us. I did not look back at her again. I did not need to, because in that brief, quiet exchange, everything had already been decided. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that there was no room left for her to step in again. The moment the officiant finished speaking, the air shifted again, but this time it was not tension that filled the space. It was release, a quiet, collective exhale that moved through the guests as they realized that nothing had been broken, nothing had been derailed, that what they had come to witness had unfolded exactly as it should. Daniel's hand tightened gently around mine as the final words were spoken, and when he looked at me, there was no confusion left in his eyes, no lingering uncertainty about what had almost happened, only a quiet certainty that we had crossed into something real together, something that no one else could alter or control. The applause began softly at first, then grew, warm and genuine, wrapping around us in a way that felt both distant and grounding at the same time. And for a moment, I simply stood there, letting it settle, not as validation, but as acknowledgement that the moment belonged exactly where it was supposed to. I turned slightly toward Daniel, offering him a small, steady smile, and he returned it without hesitation, his expression open, unguarded, as if the rest of the room had faded into the background. And in that quiet exchange, I realized something that had nothing to do with Margaret, nothing to do with what she had tried to do, or how close she had come to reshaping this day. None of it had touched what mattered most. We stepped forward together, moving down the aisle as the guests rose to their feet, their smiles warm, their attention fixed on us, and I could feel the subtle shift in the energy around us, the way people leaned in, the way they followed our movement, not because they had been told to, but because it felt right. That was the difference. Not control, not manipulation, but alignment. As we reached the end of the aisle, I allowed myself one final glance behind me, not out of curiosity, not out of concern, but out of closure. Margaret was standing exactly where she had repositioned herself earlier, her posture still composed, her expression still carefully arranged. But there was something missing now, something that had been there at the beginning of the day and was no longer present. Certainty. The second bouquet had been quietly moved to the side, no longer visible in the center of the space, no longer waiting for a moment that would never arrive. And in its absence, the entire scene felt cleaner, clearer, as if something unnecessary had finally been removed. Our eyes met briefly, just for a second, and in that second, everything that needed to be understood was already clear. I did not look away first. I did not need to. And then I turned forward again, continuing toward the reception, toward the rest of the day that still belonged to us. Later, as the music began and conversations filled the room once more, I found myself standing near one of the tall windows, the late afternoon light filtering through the glass in soft, golden lines, and I watched as people moved through the space, laughing, celebrating, completely unaware of how close this day had come to being something else entirely. Daniel joined me quietly, his presence familiar and steady, and for a moment, we simply stood there together, not speaking, not needing to. "Are you all right?" he asked eventually, his voice low, careful, and I turned to him with that same calm expression I had carried all day. "I am exactly where I need to be," I said, and I meant it. Because in the end, nothing Margaret had done had succeeded in changing that. She had not ruined anything. She had only revealed something. And sometimes, that is the only kind of ending that matters.